Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've recently been reminded of the story of the man who wakes up from his anaesthetic halfway through an operation to find the surgeon standing over him having pulled out the wrong internal organ. And so he starts to sing, "You can't take that away from me." Well, hopefully you'll recognise the reference to a George Gershwin song from the Ginger and Fred musical, Shall We Dance?, which, whilst not necessarily a commercial success in the late 1930s, is for me one of the high watermarks of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers sequence of RKO films from the 1930s. And it is those films, and in particular the career of Ginger Rogers, that we're looking at again this week. If you remember, last week we were talking with Miles Eady, film historian, curator and fabulous conversationalist, about the career of Ginger Rogers, which is also being celebrated by the BFI, the British Film Institute, as part of their season of films, which is now currently on and runs through most of April 2023, called Ginger Rogers All That Sass, and which celebrates the career of Ginger Rogers in films, because she was a versatile talent and had an amazing career which spanned many decades, and which encompassed straight drama, comedy and, of course, musical films. As we said last week, she was there at the beginning of the rebirth of the film musical when she started working with Busby Berkeley in the early 1930s. And then, of course, she became synonymous with the film musical for her work with Fred Astaire over the rest of that decade, when she appeared in 9 amazing musicals from RKO. And then in 1949 she returned to musical films one more time to appear in a reunion film with Fred called The Barclays of Broadway. And we'll be talking about that film in some detail in this episode, along with so much more. So once again, I'll be giving you details about that BFI film series, Ginger Rogers All That Sass, after the conversation you're about to hear. But let's get down to business and listen to the second part of that wonderful conversation I had with Miles about Ginger Rogers. I'm sure you'll enjoy this second part of this in-depth look at this amazing acting talent. Musical Talk. Well, Miles, absolutely wonderful to be talking to you again, and to be talking to you again about Ginger Rogers and her career. Now, of course, we've been concentrating on her musical career, and we'll be talking about that again. But let's talk briefly, before we go back to her musical career, about how that career expanded during the time of the Fred and Ginger musicals, which is essentially the two-thirds of the 1930s, and then onwards, because I think Kitty Foyle and Roxy Hart, perhaps even more so, are the breakthrough acting pieces for her, would you say?
Well, I would suggest there's a really interesting point. I think it's 1937, where both Fred and Ginger want to go out on their own. So we were talking earlier about Fred being scarred by his time with Adele, and he was equally scarred by his time with Ginger, because he'd got out of 20 years of being with his sister only to be lumped with somebody else that he didn't want to be part of a team.
Yes, the cultural connection of Fred and Ginger, that coupling, which is still alive in people's understandings and memories today, is very strong, and I can understand someone wanting to escape from it, even though it's terribly successful. That's quite a dichotomy of emotions there, isn't it?
Absolutely, but I think the thing is, in order to try and prove his talent away from Adele, he was so good at proving his talent that what he did was he created Fred and Ginger with Ginger. He created the dance, the persona, and he was so good at it that he created a seagull round his neck for the next 6 years. And he was desperate to get away from this, desperate to prove that he had solo credentials. So he goes off and makes Damsel in Distress, which is not a huge hit. And it's his first film without Ginger, whereas Ginger has been making lots of films all the way along with other people, co-starring Jimmy Stewart and other people. And at the same time he's making Damsel in Distress, she's making Stage Door with Katharine Hepburn. Now, those two films are a world apart in terms of how they've been received, in terms of, their cultural currency. And Ginger's really laying down her card as a serious actor. Now, you may say, Stage Door has a sort of theatrical... There's a kind of Gold Diggers of 33 vibe about it. It's kind of quick. There's a lot of funny lines being thrown around. And it's sort of Ginger's home territory. But I think it's a stepping stone for her being taken as a serious actor, because she's in the shadows, as it were, of Katharine Hepburn. Then Kitty Foyle is her, I think, her first post-Fred and Ginger movie. It's definitely after Vernon and Irene Castle. And it's 1940, and she wins the Oscar for Best Actor, actress as it was called in those days, which is a stunning career development.
Well, it proves a point, rather, doesn't it?
Yeah. Fred was never going to win Best Actor.
No.
Fred was a dancer. He was very rarely, I can't think of a film in which he didn't sing, dance or act until the twilight time of his career.
But he even dances in the Towering Inferno, although, admittedly it's a kind of sort of slow ballroom dance.
Yeah, sure.
Ghost
absolutely.
Story, perhaps.
Yeah, totally. But Fred is always identified with song and dance because that's his strength. It's all three together. Take any one of them away and you haven't quite got the Fred persona. But Ginger managed to say to everyone, well, yeah, I did do all this dancing, but look at what I can do. She makes her name in Kitty Foyle as a straight actor. This is, a stunning change from her last Fred and Ginger movie, having been the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, which is showing the series at the end of its creative powers. It's a very expensive movie. It's £2 million, whereas Flying Down to Rio cost $400,000 for Flying Down to Rio, $2 million for Vernon and Irene Castle. Not very well received. Maybe people didn't like the fact that they were married in it. And then she goes on and wins the Oscar for Kitty Foyle. But where do you go after you've won the Oscar? And for her, she didn't go down the Katharine Hepburn route of sort of always trying to win Oscars. But she was in a range of films where she was a big box office star. And at that point, she is the box office star. And Fred is really struggling. He makes a series of pretty poor movies in which he is always magnificent.
So second chorus?
Second chorus, he struggles to find the right partner, so he makes the incredible Broadway Melody of 1940 opposite Eleanor Powell. Now, Eleanor Powell is a better tap dancer than Fred Astaire. People can send me to prison for saying that, but she is. And her screen power and persona is stronger than Fred's, and he's slightly outclassed and outshone in this film. So he doesn't want to make any more films with her because he's been upstaged. He then becomes a dance partner in a couple of films with Rita Hayworth.
You Were Never Lovelier.
You Were Never Lovelier?
No, I'm telling you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I did try and put on my loveliest dress today. And whilst Rita Hayworth is actually a surprisingly better dancer than you might imagine, she did have quite a lot of dance training as a kid. Well, the thing is, Fred used to dance in vaudeville with her dad.
Oh, crikey.
And remembers her as a tiny kid. The mismatch in age starts to become apparent between Fred and his other partners. I mean, there's 12 years difference between him and Ginger. But, when Vera Ellen is coming on screen looking like she's all of 19, and Fred is very much in his, late 40s?
This is the Belle of New York, I think.
Belle of New York, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And
which is a kind of prototype Guys and Dolls, but less good.
Yeah, filmed at the same time as Singing in the Rain. On the same in the studios at the same time. By the time you get to Fred and Vera Ellen, that mismatch is quite hard to watch, and then it gets to Daddy Longlegs, where I believe Leslie Caron is 19 and Fred is very late 50s, and that mismatch in age becomes difficult to watch, especially with the theme of Daddy Longlegs, where he sort of falls in love with the teenager. Anyway, Fred struggles to find an identity until I think he makes it into the Freed unit at MGM. So the Freed unit make the solid gold Cadillac colour musicals with an incredible unit of creatives, directors, art directors, songwriters who have been doing this together for many, many years, and they best service Fred on screen, possibly realising he works best as a solo, and they really give him the best support to help him do that. So if you look at the filming style of any of the black and white RKO Fred and Ginger movies versus what's happening in the Barclays of Broadway, for no other reason, Barclays of Broadway is worth watching for how better filmed it is.
It's sumptuous in that sense, isn't it?
Absolutely brilliant. The camera movement is incredible. So, thing to watch out for in the black and white RKO Fred and Ginger movies is that the camera on a dolly can only go in and out. But by the time they're working, Fred is working with MGM, the camera can go sideways. And it's a much more fluid experience. There's a wonderful story about Hermes Pan behind what they called the Fred Astaire dolly, because he knew the choreography.
Yes.
And you have these, big, strong guys pushing this dolly with this, heavy camera.
Heavy cameras in those days, yeah.
Yeah,
very much
absolutely. So. And Hermes Pan is off camera going, pull, push.
So he's choreographing the camera work to match... Oh, well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so the camera... So with Fred's... let's talk about the filming style, shall we? So Fred, when interviewed backstage before he'd made any films, he says, look, no one has managed to capture dance on film. And the Busby-Berkeley filming style is antithetical to what Fred wanted and did.
Well, it's abstract in a sense, isn't it? It's magnificent to look, but it's sort of... I find enough, I love Busby-Berkeley, but I do find it so abstract that it becomes... It's an extra to the human story that's being told in 42nd Street and Gold Diggers and beyond.
Yeah, and they're presented in the movies as being extra.
Yeah.
In the reality of the films, do you know what? I'm not going to say this because I don't agree with it. Mostly, people say Busby-Berkeley numbers are showpieces within the film, but I Only Have Eyes for You isn't. That is a love song within the...
Yes, it's... They're on the tube, or
exactly.
The subway.
They're on the subway,
yeah.
And also I'm Going Shopping with You. I don't think is a number within a stage show. I think it's in the plot. Anyway,
can I ask? But by the time you're getting that, you've got Fred and Ginger adding the. This is a discussion I've had before. Funnily enough, when we were talking about the musical series in 2019 that the BFI did, which was magnificent. It's that Busby-Berkeley, I should say. I'm going to...
You're going to go to
both options are available.
Yeah.
The Busby-Berkeley musicals, those early Warner Brothers musicals, reinvent... I know I'm telling you what you know, but they reinvent musicals because at that stage, in America, not anywhere else, the Hollywood musical was terribly unliked. And the studios were cutting songs left, right and centre from otherwise possible musicals. And funnily enough, I think they made a film version of Ginger Rogers' stage debut musical, the one before, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one before Girl Crazy. And they recorded something like 10 songs and only 2 made it into the final cut because presumably Gold Diggers of 1929 or whatever it is ruined it for everybody. Although it's what's left of that, which is about 10 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's actually quite great. I like the 2 songs.
Yes, absolutely.
But anyway, for whatever reason, in that period, from 1929 to 1933 or whatever, musicals with a commercial death in America, not anywhere else.
Definitely.
Warner Brothers recreates them, Busby-Berkeley recreates them, but they are spectacle. Spectacle is still... They've moved from the overloaded spectacle to the considered clever cinematic spectacle. I mean, I'm shorthanding this. But I think the Fred and Ginger musicals are the next step. I think they take the best of the concepts of those Warner Brothers musicals, those Busby-Berkeley ones, but then by sticking a couple so firmly in the middle, even when they're playing the secondary couple, it sort of personifies the musical. And I think it then brings it back into the... Oddly, they're more rom-com-y. It's a terrible phrase, and I don't mean that quite. I'm using it as a shorthand.
Yeah.
But than the Warner Brothers ones, those are fables, and these are rom-com-y. He said very, very broadly. And so you were talking about I Only Have Eyes for You being on the subway, but that's a slightly later Busby-Berkeley film, by which time the Fred and Gingers have started. Yeah. So I'm wondering if they're actually feeding off each other.
I'm sure they are. And the thing to tell here is about the production numbers in Fred and Ginger movies.
Yes.
In Flying Down to Rio, the song Flying Down to Rio is a production number.
Yeah.
Planes, Girls on Planes, Craziness. Their next film is The Gay Divorce, which ends in another production number.
That's The Continental.
The Continental.
And that is a proper production, isn't it?
Which is a proper production number, and it's 18 minutes long.
Yeah.
Almost as long as Lullaby of Broadway in Gold Diggers of 1935. And the reason these were included, so Hermes Pan mostly choreographs The Continental, apart from Fred and Ginger's bits, which Fred would have choreographed, but that's 2 minutes within an 18-minute sequence. But the reason they're including it is because they were popular. So their next film is Roberta, which ends on a fashion show which is a sort of spectacle. It's not quite the same.
But if you're bringing changes, it's the best alternative from doing the same thing again. Actually.
Exactly,
Yeah.
it is. It's a version of it, but they're getting smaller. And then Top Hat is the final production number that they have, which is the Piccolino at the end. So there's a sort of through line back to the Busby Berkeley musicals, but they're getting smaller and they're getting more Fred and Ginger. By the time you get to the Piccolino is a parody.
Yes.
You're supposed to... it's referencing the Continental because it's saying, imagine there was this song like the Continental, but it isn't actually written by an Italian guy. It's written by a Latin who sat in his flat in Manhattan.
Yes,
so it's
drain
it's a
your glass
parody.
of vino.
Absolutely, it's not. You're not supposed to take it seriously as a number within itself, and that's it. And then the production numbers stop from there on out. You might say that the Yam is a production number, but I think that's a dance number, a dance step number. Interesting thing to note is that it's always Ginger who sings the dance songs. All the songs which are about dances, Fred wouldn't sing. And he gives them to Ginger. And actually, in terms of celebrating Roger's part in these films or looking for what she brings, have a look at those production numbers because she leads on them. And they don't sing at the same time as well. They very rarely, there's one or two lines where they sing together, but they never, it's usually he sings, she sings, or they're singing separately.
Well, I really wanted to talk about Ginger as singer then, but I just want to add a full stop to this conversation, or this element of the conversation, where I think you can argue, and I think you're saying the same thing to a degree, but the two strands of films, the Warner Brothers, Busby Berkeley's and the Fred and Ginger's, two different production companies, two different sets of directors. Mark Sandwich, I think, isn't it, for the director?
Sandwich, not Sandwich.
Sandwich. Oh, well, I was hungry. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
well,
Mark Sandwich.
I do apologise. They are borrowing from each other, but I suppose I say they're borrowing from each other. What they're doing is they're both creating musical forms which then become archetypes, and therefore from archetypes you borrow from each other. So I do, but I take your point about the production numbers in a way, and by production numbers we mean more than just Fred and Ginger, but actually what we might call formation dancing in the old-fashioned come dancing ballroom step concepts. You know, more people doing lots of things and moving from singer to singer. So I absolutely buy that, and they become dance steps. So you're right. Let's Face the Music of Dancing, Follow the Fleet, which is the film after Top Hat, is just Fred and Ginger, and tells a story, but it is a dance story. It is not. You're quite right. No, everything you say there is completely interesting.
So there's a really interesting point here, and I read this in a book about Busby Berkeley's work, which is about the integration...
Busby Berkeley, yes.
Busby Berkeley, which is about the integration of dance and spectacle in Fred and Ginger movies versus his films. And essentially, the book was arguing that the Berkeley's work in his Warner's Great Depression musicals, should we say Footlight Parade, Gold Diggers of 33, 42nd Street, the spectacle is divorced from the plot within the reality of the film. You are watching this film, a guy is doing something, the story stops, and then you get the spectacle. And he was saying that the antecedents for this was that, you know, if you look at the Barnum and Bailey shows or something like that, that's where that comes from. And that kind of spectacle had been popular in Broadway earlier, but Berkeley was bringing a slightly old-fashioned view of spectacle. Broadway had moved on, and dance was smaller and more intimate. And so what he was bringing to film was actually some old Broadway ideas. And then when Fred and Ginger start, this absolutely blew my mind, this thinking, which is the integration. So people love talking about the integrated musical, which is what
yes, they do.
Song, dance, merge with plot, emotion and character, and rather than just being a spectacle where we stop and watch people dance, it forwards the plot, or you learn something about the character. And in the Fred and Ginger movies, what has happened, a key difference between the Busby Berkeley movies, which have sort of shown the way to everyone. They've said, this is how you can do musical on film. And then the RKO guys come along with less budget and possibly a bit more creativity and maybe some more theatre feel. Definitely Fred is a theatre star. What happens is that the mismatch between plot and spectacle is shifted, and that the spectacle of the dance is lessened, but the unreality of the plot is heightened. Oh. So in 42nd Street, it is ripped from the headlines. It's reality. Yeah. People are poor, they're hungry, they have, they feel pain. People are following multiple sexual partners. They are being punched in the face by gangsters. In Fred and Ginger, the plots are light and airy and glamorous and like a P.G. Wodehouse farce. It's a high farce. But
Soufflé.
The tone rises to match the tone of the songs. So that when the songs come, thematically, artistically, from tone, from rhythm, they match the scripts. Whether this is intentional or not, I think they worked on it as time went on. But that's why I think the films as a whole work really well. And you can take the Fred and Ginger numbers out and just watch them on their own, they're something. But if you watch them in the gloriousness of the plot, and there's a lot of, a lot of bad feeling about these plots, and people say, oh, they're wafer thin. Actually, I think they are brilliant. It's very much, I think, taking the P.G. Wodehouse idiom of high farce. You have Edward Everett Horton and Eric Blore as sort of Jeeves and Wooster. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Where he says, very whimsical, sir. And you have Edward Everett Horton with his sort of king of the double take. That's straight out of Jeeves and Wooster.
It is, absolutely,
the misunderstandings, language being misunderstood, people getting the wrong names. If you don't like that kind of thing, you're not going to like the Fred and Ginger movies. I love that kind of thing. And I think they work really well. Wanted to tap into something that you said, which is really interesting. This either is going to, again, explain everything, or just make everything completely confusing. It's something I only really recently worked out. You mentioned about the difference of the films and why suddenly they're the stars in one film and then they're the secondary team in one film. And then they're the stars and the next film they're the secondary team. And, what the hell is going on here? It's quite interesting that I think what happened was, this is because the only person planning this series was Pandro S. Berman, who was the very young producer. So he was in his 20s, and accidentally they struck gold in Flying Down to Rio. And the chemistry between Fred and Ginger popped out of the screen, and everyone could see this was something to capitalise on. So Pandro S. Berman goes to Astaire's agent, who is incidentally also Ginger Rogers' agent.
How convenient.
Very convenient. So that agent is making a lot of money here. And he says, look, let's make some films. And Fred goes, absolutely not. I am not going to be in another double act. I've just come out of being a double act, and it's not going to happen again. And Pan Berman sends a wire back that says to Fred's agent saying, we could make a lot of money out of this. And whilst we can make a lot of money, it would be stupid not to try and make as many of these films as possible. So Fred is resistant against this and doesn't want to make any more films. Pandro S. Berman didn't plan to make 9 films in a row, but they happened. And so whilst he's planning the gay divorce, he buys the rights to it, he sees the show in London, buys the rights, puts the film together, and they're making that. He's the one who's thinking ahead. So that's in production. So he's going, what are we going to do next? And the thing he knows that works at that point is Flying Down to Rio. So he looks back to Flying Down to Rio and goes, hang on, okay, in that they were the secondary comedy double act.
Oh, I
see.
Let's
be inspired by that. He gets his scriptwriters together. Alan Scott works on more scripts than anyone else. There's Dwight Taylor as well and various other writers. He goes to the guys and says, well, look, what can we create out of this? And Gay Divorce, the film is called The Gay Divorcee because it was thought that calling a film The Gay Divorce sounded like you were making divorce sound like it was fun.
Yes.
So if you made it The Gay Divorcee, it meant that the divorcee himself was having fun. It's not himself. It's
actually her. It's
herself.
Ginger is Ginger wants to be a divorcee.
She wants to be a divorcee. So the gay divorcee describes someone who is happy about being divorced rather than divorce itself being happy. So they don't know whether that's going to be a hit when it's in production.
So it's production lag.
So he's looking ahead. He then they're not going to make a new project. So they already have Roberta. They've already got the rights to it. They say, well, look, let's put that into production and we'll put Fred and Ginger, who we think are going to work. They're making this gay divorce film and we'll put them in it. So they start production on Roberta as Gay Divorce is being released. Gay Divorcee is a massive hit.
Yes.
They really hit. All the responses up and down around the country, around the world is these guys are brilliant. So they put Roberta into production. So as they're putting Roberta in production, Pandorus Berman is in his office going, well, what are we going to do next? Well, I'm hearing the newspaper reports are telling me the Gay Divorcee is a huge success. So let's make something like the Gay Divorcee, right? So he gets the scriptwriters in, said, what can we do? And I said, well, let's make something new. Let's not base it on something we've already had. Okay, Gay Divorcee was great. Fred, sort of higher echelons of society, meets a stranger, they fall in love, they do, they don't, Top Hat.
Indeed.
So they call it Top Hat, and it's a new thing, it's a new film. And you can see that what's happening here, whilst they're making Top Hat,
yes.
he's going, what are we going to do next? Let's look at the last success. We've got all the success coming in from Roberta. The press are saying they're absolutely brilliant comics. So I said, oh great, they're telling me it's comic that people want to see them doing. So let's do a film where they're the secondary couple, and it works like that. You've got one in production, and he's looking back to the one that...
So it's almost... Yeah, it's in lockstep with the film before last.
Yeah.
That is a really interesting... Yeah, it's a production lag issue, almost.
It is. And then what happens with Berman's plan is... So basically, Swing Time, Top Hat and Gay Divorcee are sort of versions of each other.
Yes.
Shall We Dance is very different. And by that time, I think Shall We Dance is a response to the fact that people say, we're a bit bored with this. Or people might get... I mean, 9 films in 6 years is a lot of films.
Yes.
I can't think of anyone who has made 9 films in 6 years of a double act or a particular, Harry Potter, what was that, 7 films over
a number
of
years, yes, quite.
Yeah, and so they're trying to shake things up for Shall We Dance. So it's like, oh, let's do something different. And they try something different, and it's not as successful. And the box office returns are less. So Berman is looking at that going, what do we do? Yeah. We've got to shake things up again because Shall We Dance wasn't as successful. Let's do something completely different. Let's do something which plays to Ginger Rogers' acting skills. So their first post-stage door and damsel in distress movie is Carefree. So Ginger's probably, she's a good actor, let's give her an acting part.
It's the one with the fewest songs in as well, isn't it?
It's very short as well, it's an hour and a half. But it does feature, it's the only film which features a psychotherapist who can play golf, sing, tap dance and play the mouth organ at the same time. That's not something you would get to see in Sigmund Freud's story. So they try to shake things up again for Carefree, and Carefree is even less successful than Shall We Dance. And the team go, oh dear, what have we done? As far as I'm aware, the story of Vernon and Irene Castle gets made because they've already bought it and they've committed to it earlier on, at the time when they were more successful. So I think it's 2 years before, 36 or 37. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Fred and Ginger's RKO contracts come to an end just after they make that movie. So it may be a contractual obligation for both of them. So even though the films taken in chronological order seem a little bit weird and one doesn't seem to follow the other, when you put it in that context, it starts to make sense.
It does, absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? Because unlike any film series, it starts off tentative, finds its way, hits a peak, stays there for a bit, goes off a bit. People start to worry, it goes off in different directions and then ultimately falters. We mentioned the Carry On films in a previous conversation. It's not unlike that profile. It's the profile of a lot of successful films, series which have ended. It's interesting to me that I think Shall We Dance is one of the high watermarks, artistically, musically. It's one of my favourites in the sequence. But, as you say, it's sort of the beginning of the end, oddly. And it's interesting that, Gershwin, who's such a name, at least now, and absolutely was in the 1930s, but was hitting a slightly awkward patch after the Speech Marks failure of Porgy and Bess, and a number of he had a better 20s than the 30s in terms of his artistic creativity. He comes to the sequence quite late. It's the great names we've already mentioned. Vincent Newman, Irving Berlin gets several cracks. We've got Jerome Kern. I know Cole Porter's been imported in from a piece he did already. Yeah. But I think that the score for Shall We Dance is unstoppably brilliant.
It is, and I have a theory about this. It's my theory. It's nobody else's. Don't try and shoot any other messengers but me. Which is that in trying to find the Fred and Ginger identity, you've got sort of 3 tester movies, which are the first 3: Flying Down to Rio. Wow, this works. Gay Divorcee. Well, let's try and do something Fred's already done. Yeah, that was good. That worked well. And Roberta, which is sort of let's make anything to get us to more box office and that we can make money. And then Top Hat is the first time they've kind of put the brakes on and go, okay, if we were going to make the first Fred and Ginger movie, knowing what we've known, let's do it. And I have
by design.
By design, absolutely. It's tailor-made to both of their strengths. And I think this is just my theory, which is that I think Irving Berlin is trying to do a George Gershwin. And Irving Berlin, as a songwriter, is a chameleon. We were talking earlier about people who are able to be chameleons. And there is no one Irving Berlin. Yeah. There are Irving Berlin songs. You could put an album together of, flag-waving anthems written by Irving Berlin. You could put love songs together. You could put rags from the 1900s, early 1900s together.
Yiddle and his fiddle, I believe.
You're right. And this is the same person who wrote Blue Skies.
Oh, indeed, yes.
He wrote... so Blue Skies is interesting, just as a side tangential, which is that he was being Rodgers and Hart for that one. So Rodgers and Hart had written the show, and the producer said, this is missing a hit. The producer went to Irving Berlin and said, can you write a hit?
And
they put one Irving Berlin song in, and his Rodgers and Hart song was better than all the other Rodgers and Hart songs. And Rodgers admitted this. He said it was the best thing in the whole thing. And I think that Irving Berlin's, we're talking about Ginger Rogers being a good actor. Another way of looking at it is, being a chameleon, taking on the flavour of what is needed. I think Irving Berlin is an incredibly good songwriter, writing for the situation or the show that it needs. There is no one style. Whereas Gershwin kind of does have a style. It has a kind of bluesy sophistication. It's, the world of the Algonquin. It sounds like shiny Bakelite to me. And I think Irving Berlin does really well in Top Hat in trying to emulate that George Gershwin feel.
Well, I don't disagree with you, funnily enough. I would actually say that Irving Berlin is spottable by his lyrics and not by his melody, because I think he's the master of the simple lyric. Or at least apparently simple lyric. You'll be aware of the song Lazy, which actually sounds like it's dawdling and slow. In fact, it's different in every... it doesn't repeat itself at all. It's certainly not A, B, A or whatever. Yeah. So I think you can, if you've got an ear for it, you can spot an Irving Berlin from his lyric, because he's a double threat. I think you're right. Gershwin melodies are very distinctive. Ira Gershwin lyrics are pretty distinctive, so much so that Sondheim has a crack at them in Follies. Yeah. But I think you're right. In the Gershwin sound is not just the Gershwin sound; it's the sound of the age. I think the late Benny Green said something like that. But actually, not only was it the sound of the age, but George Gershwin sort of knew that he was writing the sound of his era, and all the others
definitely
are under that umbrella.
Yeah.
And nothing says to funny enough, I think nothing says to the 1930s and 20s more than a Gershwin sound, and yet in the modern ear, funnily enough, I hear a lot of songs from the 1940s, I hear a lot of songs which are written as 40s pastiches, which are often described as Gershwin-esque, and you think, well, the man was dead by then.
Yeah,
but that's a technicality.
Right.
But somehow, in the popular conception, a Gershwin sound now is thought of as being a 40s thing. I don't know why that time shift has occurred.
Crazy.
But I agree with you. To be achieved. But why did it take so long for Gershwin? Why did it take so long to get Gershwin in?
They'd been really burned by their first film experience.
Is that delicious?
It was delicious in 1930, possibly 1931. They'd had an absolutely horrific time of it, and they said, we are not doing any more films. And so off they went. And in the meantime, George said, I'm going to completely rewrite what is possible on the stage, and came up with Porgy and Bess. Porgy and Bess is a very problematic piece. It's a very difficult piece to try and come to terms with today. At the time, it was a flop, but it was also lauded by the artistic community. He thought it was an incredible thing he was trying to do.
And no one would argue, even today, you're quite right, I understand what you're saying, the politics, as it were, the race politics is difficult from the modern perspective, and who wrote for what. But no one would deny that the score is magnificent. Even now.
Absolutely.
And it was on at the E&O only a few years ago, and it will continue to be revived.
Yeah, totally. And hopefully each generation can
find its
find its way in it. Yeah. But I think they had the relative day. George had the difficulties of Porgy and Bess. Some money on the table for writing these songs, but also their personal connection with Fred and Ginger. And those songs, unlike any other film in the series, each of them are classics and standards.
There's no dropout there. I agree with you.
No, it's all killer, no filler. Even with someone like Irving Berlin, Carefree is full. There's a couple of songs where you go, we don't need this. Thank you. This is superfluous. Whereas in one film you've got Slap That Bass. They can't take that away from me. And we've also got They All Laughed, which they dance on roller skates. To name but a few. Interestingly, in that film, they throw that They Can't Take That Away From Me. It's not really danced, and they revived it later on for Barclays of Broadway.
Yes, it's an interpolated song, isn't it?
It is, so Harry Warren and Ira Gershwin wrote the songs and the tunes and lyrics for Barclays of Broadway, and they interpolated a George song in, and Harry Warren was not happy about this. Nobody asked him whether he was okay.
But that brings us on to the Barclays of Broadway. Now, I'm going to have to say this. It is a Fred and Ginger film. And we were talking about how they are all different, but at one level they are of a series. And then you get this one 10 years later, different production company, older Fred, older Ginger. And it feels different. I like it, but it feels... It's an odd film, I think. And you can see it as the coda. But let's talk about the score. I think almost all the scores up to Carefree, so not including Vernon and Irene,
which doesn't have a score. It's just
exactly.
It's a trunk musical.
It's
a
telling
jukebox
a story, isn't it?
Various bits.
Jukebox. That's exactly what it is. Yes, it's pulling out it's a First World War story essentially.
It is, and they're restricted in that movie by truth. They can't not do what happened. And you've also got Irene Castle off camera, very unhappily tutting loudly when poor old Ginger Rogers' ribbons aren't the right colour and things like that.
Yes, talk about getting too close to your... Precious, I think, is the word, isn't it? But if you take... the score of Flying Down to Rio is fabulous.
Yeah,
all the way through to Carefree. Every one of those is a solid hit, and it's full of solid hits in their own right. Even the lesser songs, Let's Knock Knees, I think, is an interpolation. I know. It's one of the songs that no one ever remembers. No one remembers it from the Gate of Forsake.
No one wants Edward Everett Horton for his singing and dancing.
Well, that is true.
Or his knees, to be honest.
But
put them away, Edward, it's fine.
But the song is a Cole Porter number. You can see someone has said, let's get Cole Porter without paying Cole Porter. It's Let's Misbehave. It's crikey, there's a thesis in let's do songs from the 1930s that start with word let's, like Let's Fall in Love.
Let's Misbehave. Did you just say?
I did. But Cole Porter is well up there. But Let's Face the Music and Dance. Let's is Lithuanian and Let's Do It. There we are. It's hidden even there. But
that plays into the thing about Irving Berlin being a chameleon and picking stuff up. I'm sure he will have known that that's how you start successful songs. And whether or not he probably did. And the genius of Irving Berlin is I don't think he studied it. I think it was just natural.
Absolutely. He was a singing waiter, wasn't he? It's by ear and head. But I think the scores are brilliant. And then, as you say, we have the Vernon and Irene Castle, which is different by design. And then we've got the Let's Bring Them Back, although now, as it were, 10 years later, 1949, I don't think that scores up to it. I'm really sorry to say. It's a great pity that, Irving Berlin and Cole Porter were still writing. They could have, Rogers, Hart was dead. I suppose Richard Rogers was probably a bit busy in 1940 making a lot of money with Oscar Hammerstein on stage.
Yes, exactly.
But I always think it's sad, actually, we never got to Rogers and Hart, Fred and Ginger. And Harry Warren.
It nearly happened.
No, which one?
So On Your Toes was pitched to Fred as a film.
And he's mentioned in it. There's a song
So they read in the trade press whilst the Gate of Forsay was being made that RKO were looking for ideas for films. And they pitched to him. They went to him and said, right, we've got this idea about we're going to merge the world of ballet and vaudeville, and it'll be this farce and da-da-da-da. And Fred turned it down. Pandref Berman said it was a great idea. Fred said, no, not for me. No one's going to buy me in a part where I can't wear white tie and tails. And then they made Shall We Dance, which is about vaudeville, jazz dancer, and the world of ballet.
He plays Petrov.
Where did they get that idea from? So it nearly happened.
Rogers
and Hart.
That would have been.
But then they
superb.
retooled it for Ray Bolger, and his sort of rubber-legged shtick became much more part of that. But I quite like playing in my head what the
Fred version
looked like.
I did not know that.
There you go. So,
but Harry Warren, of course. Sorry, taking us back to that. Harry Warren, of course, was the man who wrote. Well, one of the men who wrote the music for 42nd Street.
Yeah,
and indeed
he wrote That's Amore.
Did he?
Yeah.
You see, that I didn't know.
Yeah, right. Really long career.
Yeah.
He wrote That's Amore, and he wrote We're in the Money. An incredible person.
And probably was.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, he's absolutely a tip-top writer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of his stuff I admire, a lot of his stuff I like, a lot of his stuff I love. Most of that is not in the Barclays of Broadway. Now, I do like, I must say, I do like My One and Only Highland Fling. It's a clever lyric.
Yeah. we'll let you have that one.
Well, I know, I like, because the word fling here is doing two things.
Yeah.
But what I don't
Which,
like about it is...
Matthew Bourne picked up on later with his show Highland Fling.
Oh, see, I don't think I realised that.
Yeah, so it's his version of La Sylphide.
Oh, is it?
It's Highland Fling.
But I am aware that it's a terrible old piece of cod scotchery, and indeed in Ira, and it's Ira's blame for it, it's not Harry Warren, but Ira's, I'm sure you've seen the instruction on this, it says very Scotch, which isn't even very Scots, it says very Scotch, and of course, the problem is it's a much better song than any of its singers allow it to be. Yeah, because they are all putting on the... They're all... Yeah, and even people like Mel Torme, who's... I love Mel Torme, and he sings it, and for me it's actually the best version of that song. But he does then fall into the trap of repeating it again with his I'm somewhere in Scotland, but nobody can tell me where accent.
Yeah, I hear you.
Somewhere near Brigadoon, probably.
Yeah, exactly. You know, probably highly influencing.
But what else? But that score fails, and that's why the Gershwin song sticks out.
Yeah, it does. And I think if you think about On the Town versus It's Always Fair Weather, I think it's the same thing. Same production crew, well, not the same. Yeah. It's not the same writers, not in the same league. But the songs in It's Always Fair Weather, you forget them as you're listening to.
Yes.
I couldn't tell you more than one song in that. I can remember feelings, I can remember kind of what it looked like. But the score is just completely unmemorable. And it's, Andre Previn, who is very, very, very good at what he does. And he's a great orchestra.
He's a great orchestra.
He's a great orchestrator. He's a great orchestrator, he's a great conductor, and maybe he wasn't a great songwriter. And they're trying things out. And with something like Barclays of Broadway, you remember that they're, as Fred said, why did you make these films? We did them to make a buck.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing. There's a couple of things so Barclays of Broadway, really interesting thing to think about. So there's a lot of bad feeling about this movie. Lots of people say it's not a Fred and Ginger movie because it's not the spirit of them. Well, I contest that it is absolutely a Fred and Ginger movie within the general plot advance of the series. So you can't have them meeting as strangers now because I knew them back in 1933 when they first got together. So they have to be married when they start. If you think about the RKO movies as being a fantasy that men and women can indulge in, where they're taken up high into the air, and it's about courtship, and it's not about marriage, it's not about being together, it's about that delicious series of events that lead to a couple getting together. And that happens over 8 films, right? And the resolution, as promised by RKO, is Vernon and Irene Castle in 1939. And at the end of that, Fred dies.
Which is story over, you'd think.
Which is, well, if that's your experience, that's hugely unsatisfying because taken as a whole, the story is you're strangers, you meet, you court, you fall in love, you get married, he dies.
Yeah.
Right, that's not great. So actually, having the Barclays of Broadway on the end says, well, actually, that's just a blip. That's just a story I was telling you. Actually, okay, this is what marriage looks like. Now, between 1939 and 1949, the world has changed. We've had World War II. The Americans didn't even have World War II when Vernon and Irene Castle was being made. But like lots of things in World War II, it looks back to World War I and it tells you a sad story about someone dying in a plane in World War I. And Barclays of Broadway is acknowledging that change. And it teases you at the beginning of the film by showing you Fred and Ginger's feet. It's a close-up on the feet. And it's this, I love this song, it's called Swing Trot. And it's one of my favourite Fred and Ginger numbers. Completely ruined by the fact that it's played under the titles.
Hasn't it been released separately, though?
Yes,
there is a clean version
without
at last.
Titles.
Yes,
and it's your tease because you see their feet and they're dancing to this swing trot, and then the camera goes up and basically the camera is saying, "Look, guys, time has moved on. These are different. Accept them for who they are now." Ginger's dancing is not going to be as good as it was because she's been out of action for 10 years. Fred's got a bit older, but he's still Fred. He's still got it. And this was a film originally tooled for Fred Astaire and Judy Garland.
Following on from Easter Parade.
From Easter Parade.
A huge hit.
So it was a huge hit, and it had songs, a few new songs, but always with Irving Berlin, a few new songs, and a whole load of other songs that he'd brought from his trunk. And she was a relatively last-minute replacement after Judy Garland became erratic.
Too unwell. Mentally.
She was unwell.
Yes.
And she made life quite difficult for Ginger. She turned up on set.
I'd heard this,
yeah,
yes.
And so the costumes had already been made for her and,
different shape, really.
Size for her. Well, another couple of feet taller, I think Ginger was. Fred, is a lovely story. Fred is on set for the first time with Ginger, first time in 10 years. And he's kind of looking at how high she is. And they're doing a dance. He goes, there's something wrong here. And he goes over to Hermes Panis and says, what? Is Ginger a bit taller? I said, I don't know. He goes up to him, what's going on? He says, I snuck on some extra high heels, higher than I would have worn in the past, because she was always very aware of not appearing taller than Fred. So the film...
Can I just say, isn't that taken and put in as a joke in the Freed unit for the bandwagon? Because there's quite a lot of looking at the very tall Sid Cerise.
Exactly. So lots of the bandwagon. Life. So the bandwagon is also written by Comden and Green, who wrote the script of On the Town, Singing in the Rain.
And with vaudeville performance in there. And you can still see them even in that 1980s, once again, we're back at Follies, aren't we?
Yeah,
They turn up with,
totally.
Elaine Stritch and everyone.
Yeah. And so they've written... So Comden and Green have written the script, and Comden and Green... time has passed and it's their era now. So that era of the P.G. Wodehouse, light, airy, black and white, it's gone. You can't do that anymore.
We're no longer in an Art Deco world.
No, absolutely. It's post-war. And that glamour and glitz, that sort of surreal, unreal quality of the shiny Bakelite, it's not a fantasy that audiences are going to buy into. So the film has to be more true to life than what's been happened. So it's not that Fred and Ginger have changed. They're the same, but the world has changed.
The context. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And to make a buck, to make some entertainment then, this film, you have to understand it in the context that it's a swap. That it was Judy Garland originally, it was supposed to expand. There's an irony here, which is that Fred was a replacement for Gene Kelly in Easter Parade.
Oh, so he was, yes, because Gene
Kelly broke his ankle.
Yeah.
Gene suggests Fred comes out of retirement to make Easter Parade. They try and make a follow-up to Easter Parade, which is the Barclays of Broadway. And you know what? Judy Garland was absolutely in fits with not having this role, saying that this was the greatest role of her career. So bear in mind, she had been Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz. She thought Barclays of Broadway was going to be the greatest film of her career. So there's a theme in the Barclays of Broadway of Dinah Barclay being a great actor. And this works well for Ginger's persona because she's got the Oscar, right? Unfortunately, there is a sequence which is a little bit embarrassing to watch where she acts the Marseillaise in an audition.
Sort of Sarah Bernhardt-y way.
Exactly.
Yes.
She's supposed to sort of be riffing on Sarah Bernhardt in a French accent. And it's
and
a
how
shame.
well does that work?
It doesn't really, and it's a misstep, and it's something that takes you out of the magic of what could have been a slightly better film. And the Freed unit were up and running doing Freed unit stuff. Comden and Green were doing Comden and Green stuff. If they had tooled the movie for Ginger, I think it would have been different.
Now that I think is a truly shrewd comment, if I may say. Yeah, it wasn't her film as envisaged.
No, absolutely. And they can't take that away from me. It was not planned to be in it, but it worked. It worked for the two of them. And the film makes lots of references to their previous career together. In the film, he acts as Ginger's character, Svengali, and there was lots of writing at the time saying, Fred is the Svengali for Ginger. And Ginger was really upset about that. He said, I'm my own woman. She's a modern woman. She's one of the few, first women to wear trousers in films. Like Katharine Hepburn is doing that. Yeah. Okay, she's doing her thing. In Roberta, she's wearing trousers. That's a really rare thing to see a woman doing at the time. And she's really, she proves that she's her own woman by being a bigger box office draw post Fred and Ginger than he was, and by winning the Oscar. And this movie riffs on that, with Fred pretending to be. We should explain. Fred and Ginger play a on-stage double act who break up. because she wants to be serious and he wants to be a song and dance man. And she...
Can I just say there's a touch of Follow the Fleet in that? Because they were a vaudeville act and they go their separate ways.
Yeah. So that's lots of this links back to
thematically
to
it does connect.
Totally. And Fred pretends to be this. She kind of doesn't quite hook up with this young French writer director, but Fred gives her stage directions on a phone, pretending to be this guy. And when he gives her these directions, it solves the problems that they've had in performing whatever the play is that they're performing. And I mean, in some ways that's kind of unfair on Rogers because you're buying into a myth that she was not that happy about. Fred had come out of retirement to make Easter Parade, and in a sense she came out of her musicals retirement to make this film. And Arthur Freed flew the script to her when they were desperate from Judy having left. And, he's a bit worried about what she'd think. And apparently she was just ridiculously happy to do the film. And really, really, she wasn't doing it against her will. She loved it. She said that she loved Fred dearly. Yeah, they squabbled. Yes, they had, the odd argument about feathers on dresses. But that would happen with any working relationship. Yeah. And you can see that mutual affection for each other in everything they do on the screen.
And it lights up the stage. It lights up the screen there. I mean, you mentioned earlier in our earlier conversation that that she, when we were exploring how far she's an actress who is dancing the role of an actress, but I think the flip side of that is yes, she's an actress and she's able to bring that acting to everything she does. But you sort of have to believe, I think, that she must have enjoyed herself doing these films, because while she's acting someone who's enjoying doing those films.
Yeah.
That acting is from a position of method then, if you want. Or so it seems. Or it would be very difficult. She would not have done as many as she did if she hadn't.
Absolutely not. And she said as much. She said, she said she really liked the rehearsal process. She loved it because it was creative and exciting. And Ginger brings loads of ideas to the table.
Oh, yes.
It's not just Fred. It was her idea to do the roller skates dance. It was her idea to end it falling over onto the grass. Her idea to end cheek to cheek in the way they did, where they spin out, feel the rain, spin back in and hold hands. It was her idea to do the shadowing in Cheek to Cheek, where they stand next to each other doing the same movements, with her shadowing him, and they're both sort of in male clothed silhouettes. But if you need any better example of the fact that they genuinely had joy, and that I think one of the things that is wonderful about Fred and Ginger is that you feel that the camera is capturing a genuine, intimate moment between people who really love being with each other. And there's a sort of voyeuristic element to that once you've seen it in one film, you want to see it again. And they play with that in Shall We Dance, where they tease you into when they're going to dance together. So at the start, he's the ballet dancer, he does the ballet dance, she does this, and you think, when are they going to dance together? Oh, they don't dance together forever. And then they're on this boat. And this beautiful music starts, and it's Walking the Dog, which is the Gershwin, which is now performed as a piece of music in its own right.
Sometimes called Promenade.
Promenade, yeah. And they start walking to this music, and you go, well, I know where this is going, because every time they walk, it's going to lead from a walk to a dance and it doesn't.
No.
And they're teasing with you because they know by this point in the series that you want to see them dance, and they've given you a tiny little bit of walking in time with the music, giving you a bit of story, developing the characters and the emotions, but there's no dance yet. Hold on for the good stuff. And if you want any better example of the fact that Ginger loved doing it, and Fred as well, have a watch, call it up on YouTube, This Minute, which is from Roberta, which is I'll Be Hard to Handle. And in that number, Ginger has just sung a brilliant comedy, really, really good comedy routine, where she's pretending to be a Polish countess. And what you see is what you get with this. It was filmed live. The sound you hear on the film is the sound that was recorded at the time. There's no taps or dubs, and listen for Ginger's laugh all the way through. It's a genuine giggle, and it's very rare that they did that. The other one, I think, which is similar in spirit and tone, to try and bolster some support for Barclays of Broadway, is the incredible number Bounce in the Blues, which I think is Ginger's best dance number.
That's a statement.
It is a very complicated tap number. It's funny, Fred didn't bring the choreography down to meet the level of the person he was dancing with. Often he brought their dancing abilities up to meet him. And Bouncing the Blues is a brilliant, brilliant tap dance. And it's rare that they both do a tap dance. So in something like Never Gonna Dance, there's no tap.
No.
That's quite interesting because I think tap equals joy. So when Fred's happy, he's tapping, he's banging things. But when there's love or they're about to part and so they think never be with each other again, he has the most beautiful line in all of Fred and Ginger's movies just before they do Never Gonna Dance, where he says, I've danced with you, I'm never going to dance with anyone else. It'll be something, but it won't be dancing. And then they launch into this number, which is beautiful, with no tap, because tap equals joy. Bouncing the Blues, the joy that you see between the two of them is brilliant. And actually, musically, it's quite difficult because there's a lot of, well, it's not stop time necessarily, but there's a bit of music and then it stops. And they keep the rhythm going themselves.
It's sort of a cappella dance.
Exactly that. And that's not easy to do.
No.
And it is the most complicated tap that Ginger is seen to do. And their synchronisation is so beautiful. And that's the synchronisation of people who've danced together over 15 years.
Well, Miles, this has been fabulous. We have looked at Ginger Rogers' career and we've looked at so many of these films which are the best musicals. There are other best musicals. I know that's nonsense, but you know what I mean. But in terms of consistent quality, these are some of the best. There's 10, and I do include Flying Down to Rio, and I do include the Busbys.
Glad to hear
the Busbys.
The
you see what I've done
there?
How Freudian am I getting there? The Barclays of Broadway. So, but the end, and this is a kind of reductive question, and you may have sort of answered it. So, but from what you said already, but. What's your favourite Fred and Ginger film? And what is your favourite Fred and Ginger sequence? And I will just offer you a couple for me. Shall We Dance is my favourite. I love Gershwin is still my go-to music when I need any kind of pep in my life. And it's also immediately, it just takes me to where I need to be. And my favourite sequence, however, my favourite dance sequence is what I'm going to describe as Fred and Ginger Go Wrong, to use the modern stage version, which is the rehearsal sequence in Follow the Fleet, where they're on a boat and they're sort of practicing and they're not getting it right. And it is a proper comedy dance. They've done dance with comedy and they've done dance lightheartedly, but they don't. This is the funny one. And the interesting thing is, it is funny, and it's funny because of the same concept as the play that goes wrong and things like that, is that they get their steps wrong in a way which is right, if that makes sense.
And it's genuinely funny.
Amazing. And the joy, we were talking a minute about the look on their faces. Yeah. You can tell and they're sort of echoing each other's kind of spasmodic movements, but also there's a moment where Fred's shoulders go up, so he looks a little bit lurch-like, as it were. And then Ginger does the same thing, and they're sort of doing this kind of very... you'd think you would describe it as clumsy, except of course it's not clumsy in any way whatsoever. It's superb. Yeah. So that for me is a highlight.
Yeah, I'm putting all my eggs in one basket is pretty unique because it gives Ginger the opportunity to be funny. And I can imagine that lots of glamorous female film stars wouldn't have been relaxed enough to be seen as comical or in a jokey way.
No, I agree with that. Yeah.
And it's stunning, absolutely stunning. And one of the reasons I think it's stunning is, okay, so it's not an emotional number, it's not something that even necessarily advances the plot, but it is stunning because pulling that kind of comedy off in dance, in time, in synchronicity, doing the wrong thing at the right time is very, very difficult.
Yes.
Really difficult. It's in some ways it's more difficult to do than trying to look like you're getting something right. But trying to say something fresh and original with your bodies only, given that you've had years and years of silent comedy, I think is stunning. It's beautiful to watch. It's beautiful slapstick comedy and genuinely very, very funny. For me, I think I would say Top Hat is probably my favourite, if only because I think the music is doing a beautiful George Gershwin tribute act. It's almost like in being the tribute, it's sort of as good, or if not sort of better than the original. I think there is a levity and a joy and a sort of airiness, this light souffle in all the right ways behind Top Hat. I think the script and the actors in Top Hat. I adore Edward Everett Horton. I have a framed photo of Eric Blore up at home.
Do you? Well, you're the right kind of man.
Yeah, absolutely. Only the right people have Eric Blore. They are just so genuinely funny still. I think the cinematography has sorted itself out a little bit, so there's lots of technical advances and changes. The grayscale, the blacks and the whites sort themselves out a little better. The setting is so beautiful. That bonkers Venice at the end for the Piccolino. No one would have thought that, would have thought that was actually Venice. An interesting thing.
It's the Bakelite Venice.
It's the Bakelite Venice. An interesting thing that Pandorus Berman wrote a wire to the powers that be at RKO and said, he didn't send it, he wrote it. He said, could we go to Venice to do some research? And he didn't send it because obviously he realised that he was going to go to Mussolini's Italy. Yeah. So that's not the thing to do. Yeah. But also, Mussolini had banned the gay divorcee because of Eric Rhodes's Italian gentleman.
Tonelli.
Yeah, absolutely. Tonetti.
Oh, is it Tonetti?
Your wife is safer with the Tonetti. He prefers spaghetti. Because he didn't think it was the right image of, a masculine Italian man.
By the way, did you know that Eric Rhodes and Edward Everett Horton worked together on a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, one of the revivals in the 1960s? There's a lovely photograph of the two of them. And what's interesting is... It's because Edward Everett Horton died, I think, in 1970, so it's getting on towards the end of his life, so he's looking a lot older. But it's just lovely to see the two of them. And the moment you look at them, you think, oh, that is Edward Everett Horton. Yeah. Oh, that is Eric Rhodes.
I hear you, yeah. Well, Blore and Rhodes have been in the stage show of the gay divorce in London, which is how they ended up in the movie. And they loved them so much. I think Eric Blore is in 5 of the Fred and Ginger movies. Basically, you can't go wrong if you've got Eric Blore in the movie. If you've got Randolph Scott instead of Eric Blore, don't bother watching the whole thing.
Fast forward.
Yeah, fast forward.
Can I just briefly talking about Tonetti then?
Yeah.
This is a sidestep. The much more recent musical, The Drowsy Chaperone, has a character called Alphonse, who is a carbon copy, and this is Eric Rhodes. I know it's tapping into a stereotype of the period, but I think Eric Rhodes is, if you like, the archetype from which Alphonse is. I can hear that.
Totally. And to answer your other question, I think my favourite Fred and Ginger number has to be Bouncing the Blues. I could watch that over and over again. Fred. For all the people who say Fred Astaire is a good dancer, despite all of that, Fred Astaire is a very good dancer. His rhythmic invention is absolutely stunning. Within one routine, he will do triple time, double time, slow things down, make it quick, and just do things that you will never have seen any other dancer do. His tapping, he could tap Gene Kelly out of the water. Gene Kelly's tap is very basic. It's the same steps over again, put in a different way. But you don't go to Gene Kelly for tap dancing. You go to Gene Kelly for the athleticism and the incredibly tight bottom. Whereas you wouldn't go necessarily to Fred for the tight bum.
I go for the toupee when it comes to Fred.
Absolutely. To Bouncing the Blues, I just think they're understanding the chemistry in the air, but also what they have learnt. There's a sort of end of the road element to it.
Or an apogee.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sort of, yeah. Not necessarily in terms of the artistic quality of the film, but just in terms of their understanding. And it's just beautiful. It's a really short sequence, but they are so relaxed. And Ginger's hair is down. It's very rare that Ginger's hair comes down. The colours there's some lovely costume elements where I think her belt matches his neck scarf. And they're playing a married couple who have known each other and performed on stage for years. And Fred and Ginger, we know they're not married, but they're a couple who are inseparable. And it's just lovely to see them. It's like they're doing their party piece years after they've been famous. I love it.
Miles, can I thank you? You've given me one of the happiest conversations I've had in years.
Me too.
This has been fabulous. Your enthusiasm is so intoxicating. To be honest, I'm on the same road as you anyway towards Fred and Ginger appreciation. Well, we're all there, I think. But Every moment has been joy and gold. So thank you so much, and I really hope we get a chance to speak again.
Absolute pleasure.
Musical Talk. And there we have it. That's Miles Eady and me talking about Ginger Rogers. And as Miles said after we finished recording, there's still so much more that we could have spoken about. And that is a testament to the incredible versatility, talent and career of Ginger Rogers. And my thanks go to Miles for being so kind to me and giving me so much time to talk about this incredible actress and the musical films of the 1930s. And my thanks too to Liz Parkinson and Richard Pickard at the BFI for helping to arrange the conversation with Miles. And if you want to find out more about Miles, you certainly can. Go along to his website, Miles Eady, MilesEady.com. And it will tell you all about this fabulous man who's a film musicals curator, a writer, and a public speaker. As he says on his own website, discover the fascinating world of film musicals with Miles Eady, mileseady.com. And don't forget the wonderful BFI film series, Ginger Rogers and All That Sass, which is focused mostly on the BFI South Bank, sometimes known as the National Film Theatre. The series has already started and it runs through to the end of April. If you want to find out more about it, go along to the BFI website, that's bfi.org.uk, and as part of that there is a wonderful chance to see a number of those Ginger Rogers musical films, as well as films from the rest of her career. A particular favourite for me, of course, is Shall We Dance, which is the Gershwin Ginger and Fred film. That's showing on a number of occasions, including on the 8th of April at 2 o'clock, which is Easter Saturday, and with it comes an extra illustrated talk by Miles Eady, which I hope will be an additional draw to the film itself, which is fabulous. There's a chance to see the Barclays of Broadway, which is their 1949 reunion film, and of course Top Hat, which for many people is the high water mark of the Ginger and Fred series at RKO. But there's a great deal more beside that. You can see Roxy Hart, the film that she made based on the 1926 play Chicago, which of course is the name it's also known as today as a musical. You can see Kitty Foyle, the film that won her an Oscar, and plenty of others like Lady in the Dark, Black Widow, the comedy Bachelor Mother, and Stage Door. And again, that film's being shown more than once, but if you go on the 2nd of April, you'll see an introduction by Sandy Toksvig. And it's not just films. There's a free Introduction to Ginger Rogers event for people who are 25 years old or under. That's on the 12th of April. And there's actually a course about Ginger Rogers called City Lit at the BFI, Ginger Rogers and All That Sass, which is a course examining the cultural and cinematic impact of Ginger Rogers. Do go along to the BFI website to find out more. And that's bfi.org.uk. So that's Ginger Rogers, All That Sass. I do hope you've enjoyed these 2 episodes talking about this talented actress and hearing all about those wonderful musical films that she was in the 1930s. She can stake a claim as being one of the major architects of the modern film musical by being there right at the beginning and in her own right with several of the real movers and shakers like Busby Berkeley and Fred Astaire for when Hollywood learnt to make musical films properly. In some senses, the 1930s was really the golden age of musical films. I know there are other golden ages, but to deny it for the 30s, I think would be wrong. And one of the people who is absolutely synonymous with that period is Ginger Rogers. That's quite a legacy. Well, thank you very much for listening to these 2 episodes of Musical Talk. Do join us again in the future where we'll be talking about something completely different. The world of musical theatre and film gets bigger, not smaller, which means there's always more to talk about. Come back next week to find out what it is we've chosen we will talk about. But until then, I'm going to give you a week off to go off and do, say, other things. And I'm going to launch that period of free time for you with the solitary word which I know that you crave after I've been talking for a long time. Here it comes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2023. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. 10 years after that 1949 appearance at the Palladium, the Chiswick Empire closed down, which was obviously the music hall in Chiswick. And do you know the last person to perform there before literally brought the house down?
What year was it?
59.
Winifred Atwell.
Oh, you're not a million miles away by instrument.
How about Russ Conway?
Once again, you're on the right. Yeah,
American?
Yes, which narrows it down.
Pianist. Who was popular at the time? Were they later? Had they had their star time?
No, I think they're still. I mean, they went on considerably longer than that.
Basie?
No.
Who was that?
Liberace. I love the idea, but Liberace finished the Chiswick Empire.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's no topping Liberace.
No, there really isn't.
Right.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
And
my brother George.
Come out.
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite incredible. What year was that? 59?
59, yes, absolutely. And I interviewed one of the surviving members of the Temperance Seven.
Yeah.
1950s jazz band, I'm sure you know. John Geeves Watson. And he was telling me that basically in the mid-60s, and he gave me a piece of memorabilia, or one of the old show bills. They did a kind of closing down the music halls tour with a pop group. So I can't remember the name of the pop group, but the pop group and the Temperance Seven were on this bills together. And basically they would go down, and then these would be the last shows that these musicals did, and then the Demolition Men came in the week after.
That's a sort of entertainment equivalent of the Beaching Report, isn't it? Sort of going around the country and closing down these little. Wow, I'm fascinated to know who the band was.
I'll see if I've got the thing. I'll see if I can get. I'll find it. It's in the loft.
It's interesting. The 60s. I always say this about the 60s pop, which is why it is the most interesting era of pop music. Is because in the charts, I think you have the most diverse range of music. You would have Jimi Hendrix rubbing shoulders with the Temperance Seven, rubbing shoulders with Bernard Cribbins,
indeed,
with Cilla Black, and this was all accepted as part of a sort of whole. And it's so diverse. You know, is 60s music Helter Skelter by the Beatles, or is it You're Digging a Hole by Bernard Cribbins? And we tend to only remember the cool stuff, and we forget the fact that, no, actually, you wouldn't get the Beatles without Digging a Hole, because that's produced by George Martin.
You've got my quiz question. Gosh, well, you see, this is why we should talk again.